The voice of the city of New York interpreted. This is one of my all-time great poems too, Joseph Stella
And
poem.
the comment I want to make is we can discuss the poem in toto if you would like to, but I want to make a comment on the epigraph chosen because that's a great way to connect and make this a standalone memoir.
Yeah.
Because it's as if all these other memoirs connected onto it. It's kind of like a butterfly effect almost.
Well, it should be stated this poem was written separately and before the memoirs. It just fit in perfectly. But that's one of the things that when you do something great is something can be standalone great, and you do something greater and you can fit it in. If you've ever seen computer animations of DNA sequencing, you see these little pink and blue and yellow and red globs, and they lock together. Well, think of this poem as one of those DNA globs that was something great in itself, that became, though, a piece of something bigger and greater.
Mm-hmm. And this is based on one of Stella's great paintings. It's one of those multi-panel paintings, correct?
Yeah.
If I remember the painting right.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Yeah, it's 5 of them, I think.
Yes, and then it's almost cubistic, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily cubistic. It's sort of. I mean, there's probably some minor cubist elements to it, but it's basically just. It's sort of he's sort of looking at the bridge the way Hart Crane did with words. So they've always been connected in my mind, and I think, in fact, one of the editions of the bridge actually has the Stella painting of.
It's precisionist, then, isn't it?
What?
It's precisionist, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not precisionist. Off the top of my head, I couldn't give you what would be considered, but Stella certainly was a great painter. Anyway, so about particular things.
Well, the one thing I want to note is it goes through each different panel. It is ekphrastic, but it doesn't just stay on the moment itself. It will use it mostly just as a jumping off point. But the main point I wanted to make is how these memoirs kind of acted as de facto butterfly effects. There's another of your short story collections called Monarchs of New York that uses its final story sort of like that in the same way, but this is much more effective in my view of using that because it's much more subtle. You get deeply right into the butterfly effect in Monarchs of New York, but this one is far more subtle in its use, and it has a greater ending than Monarchs could have conceived of.
Well, Monarchs of New York is it's not really a short. I mean, it in a sense is a short story collection, but it's actually a novel.
Individual short stories and then leads to a long novella.
Yeah, it's a novel of place because all of them become. It's all about the time and place in New York, and it goes from realistic short stories to less realistic, longer short stories to a sci-fi novella at the end. So the honey drift maze of age pulses the nude immensity of sky beyond him or you or I. Who has known stronger things and loves? I see where bridge becomes Brooklyn and you become me. Yeah, that's a great ending. It in a sense, this poem about the bridge, you could say, is a more distilled version of Hart Crane's The Bridge, and I would argue that there's probably not in its whatever it is 2.5, 3.5 pages, 4.5 pages. It's 4.5 pages. It's probably greater poesy per line per page than Crane's The Bridge. But there again, you're talking about the difference between length and greatness in length versus greatness distilled. This is as great a poem about the Brooklyn Bridge as The Bridge, but it may not be as great a work simply because of its relative brevity, even though it's, by any definition, a long poem.
Yes, you could probably take this poem and set it against any of Crane's individual poems in The Bridge, and this would be the better poem. But as you were saying, the length of The Bridge is too great to surmount for a poem that is, what is this? This is 5 or 6 pages, is it not?
Yeah, 4.5 pages, I guess. So. The Will to Believe, okay.
Yeah, The Will to Believe. This was one of the first things I ever read of yours, and it was interesting to see how this isn't it doesn't begin at one point and then go on, because there's a little bit of a thriller element to it at some point, and most stories would just stick with that and kind of go with the aftermath. But this goes into a completely different tangent into one of your favorite teachers, and then it leads into one of your great poems as well. Mr. Wallens Falls taught us well.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Talk about that teacher. Talk about also some of the other teachers in your life, education and not, that may have influenced your life, if not your art.
Did you read this online at another website first? Because this was one of those things that I put online where
yes,
I had,
years ago, and the poem was destroyed in its use. It was made to look like a prose poem in the version I read, and then when you sent me this manuscript, I seen how it was actually broken properly.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Wallenfels, it's interesting. My Jessica and I were walking this morning. I was talking about, I had two science teachers in junior high school. One was this coked up guy that I use his real name in the memoir. For all I know, he had died of AIDS. He had beaten up some kids in the school. He was a drug addict who died of AIDS in like the late 80s. My sister and some of her friends had told me this. And then years later, when I had this online, this fat girl who I knew in junior high, now a teacher, had befriended me or wanted to be my friend on Facebook, but she didn't really want to. She just wanted to sort of berate me and have me change the name of the teacher who she claimed was still alive. But I said, well, give me his thing. I'll ask him. But so this Mr. Wallenfels was the good science teacher. The other guy was the bad science teacher. Mr. Wallenfels was, I think he was originally from England, although he had very little, if any, English accent. He had this afro. He was this white guy with sort of this orangey afro. He wore John Lennon type eyeglasses. I remember he had brought a Vietnam veteran in one day to talk about the choice he made having to kill this young girl who could have betrayed his position and how it always affected him. He had bananas. This was 77, 78. I had him as a teacher. He putting condoms on bananas. What else? There was couple of other things that here talked about. Let's see.
Are you looking at the poem directly, Dan, or the prose?
I'm looking at the poem.
Okay. Well, one of the things about the poem is that it leads into that memory of the Vietnam veteran. But it's interesting how I've spoken about this to a few people before. You can't take a formal structure and then break it for no reason. So this one begins in a structured sense, and then it completely and totally drifts off into fractal little lines that move off the page, and that's in connection with this memory, and then it realigns itself at the end. That's a great technique, and it shows just based on the visuals of how you break the poem, how you can add extra things to the speaker rather than just simply go off of what the lines are saying themselves.
Right, and this is what we talked about the last time with people like Wilfred Watson or Bill Bissett or Bob Grumman. These people had no fucking clue as to why they'd bring it. Oh, I'm going to break this here. There has to be a reason why something is broken here. For example, in part of this poem here, and let's see, I'll just read a few lines here. As a supernova's silent beauty break, incinerating civilization's dreams and youth break, yet familiar break like a gorilla's break, inviting the brief interplay break of 2/3 chimps lost break from the trees break of nothingness. Now, even right there, there's probably more poetry in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines than, like I said, you're going to find in all of the works of a Dave Eggers or a David Foster Wallace. But they're broken, and one could argue maybe you could have a line a little farther to the left or a little farther to the right. But that, in a sense, is irrelevant. For like here, from the trees of nothingness, there's a break directly underneath from the trees.
This is also one of those poems that makes it look easy too, because you'll see writing, whether it's prose or poetry, that looks hard because of how structured it is. You can almost tell the writer spent hours and hours and hours editing it. But this one almost has a hash and stash way of breaking things.
Yeah.
But they're broken for a reason, and each line break adds something to it. Even if it seems at first dissonant, it will make sense in further rereadings.
Yeah, and then you get back to the last stanza where you're more structured again, and I have the last lines that go, right or wrong, immense or we, everlasting or singular, that kept, break, some apes still swinging through ancient trees, that kept, break, poor Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain is referring to, warm in some peace, that kept, break, my favorite teacher smiling on and on. Now, if you look at a line like my favorite teacher smiling on and on, that in and of itself is not inherently poetic with an ellipsis or not. But in writing, you have to know that one of the things that bad poets do, and even bad prose writers, is they try to be poetic rather than letting a natural poesy come from non-poetic things. You can have, just as you can bang on some lunch pails, you can bang on garbage cans, and that's just dissonant noise. But someone can organize that dissonant noise in interesting ways. I saw, for example, I've been melancholy these last few months that I've been out of work, and I've watched a lot of things that harken back to my youth. I recently, just a few nights ago, watched Godspell, the film of the Broadway musical, and I'm not religious or whatnot, but just its use of, for like the famous song, day by day, oh dear Lord, three things I pray. These things brought back memories of that era, hippie girls, when I was a child or a baby, and there's a comforting nature about it, and yet there's a few scenes where they're banging on things in a junkyard, like from Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, a TV show, a cartoon in the 1970s. That was like where I grew up, around a lot of these junkyards, and you get these things that aren't inherently musical, but you can take the dissonant sound and make noise from it, and that's a good example in that film, or that I don't know if they did it on stage like that, and to take prosaic lines and put them in poetic ways, so that the poetry isn't contained within each line. The poetry is formed by the way the lines are juxtaposed, by the way the lines interact with them. I've said this in our prose. The prose difference between Jessica and mine is Jessica's poetry is contained in her sentences. Jessica writes the most compressed poetic sentences that I know of in the English language. There may be someone else, but I doubt it. That's better than she is. My poetry, or my prose rather, my prose line, my prose sentence structure, because I achieved such a high degree of poetic poesy within the lines and the images of my poetry, I wanted to do something different. So I consciously, as you said, from Tumbleweeds to Vincetti Brothers and later books as you read them on, I've gone to finding poesy rather than poetry, but poesy in prose in more prosaic forms. So I've tried to heighten sometimes the poetry by heightening the prosaic nature of the writing. Now, I can only do that to a certain degree because I'm a great writer. So there's going to be little poetic techniques that sneak in one way or the other. But it's the degree to which I fool the reader into thinking something is prosaic and then putting those prosaic things together that get the poesy. So it's a constant magician's act. It's a juggling act that, as you progress as a writer or as an artist, you don't want to just be juggling the same balls all the time. Anyway.
There was the Uptown Poetry Group that you ran for a few years. There was a poet involved in it named Don Moss, who you said had his poetry and prose bleed in together. And I would argue that much of your poetry and prose does the same thing, in not necessarily how you structure it, but in how diverse it is, how it will suddenly lapse from one idea to the next.
There's a big difference, though, and when you read Don Moss's Dominions, and if you read, send me that email, and I'll ask if he'll send you some of what he called his breakfast pieces. He did a breakfast piece. He interviewed me once about Migdalia, the girl that's in these memoirs, the prostitute who was killed, and he did a breakfast piece upon one of my last times that I knew her having breakfast. He did a series of breakfast pieces. Don's poetry and prose is far more, his poetic line and his prose line are far closer together, at sometimes more indistinguishable. There's a big difference in it. Again, my poetry or my poesy in prose comes from usually a lot more different technique than in my poems.
Well, yes, I wouldn't say it's to the same extent, and I have not read both of them, so I can't compare. I'm only going on secondhand information for what you've said, but there does seem to be some stylistic similarities, only in the sense that you'll have a poem that begins on one idea, and yes, poetry is framing a moment that will lapse into many different asides. Your prose has the same kind of ability. Jessica will, like all great writers, will deal with many different things in many different ways at any one time. But yours is, she is more consciously poetic. Your poetry is, in your prose, is more identified after the fact.
Yeah, that's I've often said a very similar thing. I think it's one of the things is I just sort of stride bigger. One of the things Jessica complains about me on a personal level is that I will often get distracted, or she'll say, "Why are you bothering with that person, that writer, or something someone sent to me, or why are you wasting time watching a soap opera or watching an old sci-fi movie or what?" And I say, because this is fodder. So you will I the canvas from which I draw things into prose or poetry or my essays even, I take a far greater range of things than Jessica does. What Jessica does, Jessica gets cosmic by starting from the small and going outward. I bring the cosmos and bring it inward. So in a sense, we are 180 degrees. Jessica, not that she's really anything like Emily Dickinson, but Jessica makes the cosmic from the small, and so Jessica has a much smaller palette, but her greatness comes in making greatness from that smaller palette. My greatness is from taking things. I mean, from I have references. If you were to look at the totality of my work, I probably am 50 to 100 to maybe 200 or 300 times larger palette of things that I use. People talk about Shakespeare or James Joyce.
Jessica's also stands on its own, and yours kind of goes outward with the illusions too. It's always clinging to reality and to the outside world, whereas Jessica's, she may have that fodder as well, but she makes it completely a thing unto itself.
Yeah, and I think we approach memory in a different way too. I was watching, for example, while I was home, I was doing some work. I came back, and a couple of weeks ago, I saw a thing called the Father Knows Best reunion. Father Knows Best was an American sitcom from the 1950s, and in the late 70s, they apparently did a reunion show, and it wasn't filmed in a sitcom way. It was on videotape, and I was watching it, and there was a scene where the Andersons. This was Robert Young was the big name star there, and Jane Wyatt, and it was about them coming back together, and it had a very the Waltons like feel to it. But the thing that got me was, and why I watched the whole hour and 45 minutes or so that it was on, was there was a scene where the Andersons go to their church, and it was a Lutheran church, and I knew it was a Lutheran church even before they said it, because they were playing the famous Lutheran hymn. I don't know if you ever got in Canada or ever saw. There was a thing put out by the Lutheran Church of America called Davy and Goliath. It was the same guy who did Gumby, the Gumby stop motion cartoons. Davy and Goliath. Davy was a young boy who had a dog who talked to him, and there was the famous hymn written by Martin Luther went something like da 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 da. And this played in the Davy and Goliath cartoon. It was also in this Father Knows Best reunion. Now, for me, the draw would be that music. it would be the da da da. Where Jessica would probably focus on some smaller event. To me, I would bring something down from Martin Luther and the history of the Lutherans into that moment, whereas Jessica would take something that she remembered sitting in the pew or whatnot and bring it into that moment. That's not to say that Jessica hasn't ever done anything cosmic brought down to the small, or I haven't taken something small and expanded it outward. Certainly that's true. But I'm just talking in a general sense.
It's interesting that you mentioned that she gets on you over General Hospital and whatnot. Everyone has their own kind of personal fodder. There's crap that I enjoy that has personal meaning to me that I can use for fodder in my writing. There's also artists that I get intellectually and can gather ideas from them, like Andrei Tarkovsky, but that I can't stand as artists. And for whatever reason, perhaps because he's into all these dreamlike kind of things, and I immensely prefer Bela Tarr because his long takes are condensed, and in your memory, even if he has a 7-hour film, it will not be remembered in such a fashion. Whereas Tarkovsky can be very slow and meditative and rhapsodize about every single dream that this one character has had. So it's an interesting distinction too between like and dislike and good and bad, as well as the fact that personal fodder, even in bad works, like say a soap opera that's likely past its time, may still have some inherent meaning for you to use in later works.
Well, I told Jessica said, "What can I get from this?" Is a perfect example. I said, "Well, number one, I watched it for so many years, so it's become rote habit, even though it's well past its prime. But the reality is, I would not be the prose writer that I was if it wasn't for some of the great melodramatic stories that I saw there." And I said this. I don't know if you saw my interview with Irwin
Yeah, the whole
Shaw's son.
multiple character trope is straight from soap operas because they have dozens of characters.
Let me finish here, though. I don't know if I read just a day or two ago. I did an interview with Irwin Shaw's son. Irwin Shaw, the short story writer and novelist. His son. I put up about an hour-long interview with him, and I was talking with him about melodrama and how his father's later books became melodrama, and they're good melodramas. A Rich Man, Poor Man is a good melodramatic book. It's not. I don't think it's as great as his short story writing, but as long as you recognize that it is a melodrama, there can be great melodrama and non-great melodrama. Great melodrama is better than just merely good drama. Great drama is greater than great melodrama, but you learn the tools of narrative technique through melodrama, because melodrama you have to evince everything on that level. Melodrama cannot be subtle for it to be melodrama, because melodrama, literally going back to the Greek origin, is action with the music to give you cues. Melodrama basically is sort of like a laugh track, and so you'd have that music playing to tell you, oh, this is when you should be sad, because the music will be more evocative. And this is getting back to music. This is one of the things with musicians. Music is just purely emotional. Creatively, why? To create it, you'd use your intellect. But music cannot get into the intellect the way language can. It cannot get into the intellect the way the visual can. You can't look. You can have a great movie without music, but music can add to that. But you can, or I should say, you can have a great film with music there adding to it and making it greater. But you can totally take music away and have a great film.
I have often argued that as well, because Werner Herzog uses music than any musician playing the music himself can use, and he uses the music in a greater context. Whereas, Eric Satie, even as great a composer as he was, he only evokes loneliness and hope in most of his greatest pieces. He does not delve into greater things and character and everything. You may be able to recognize that as great music and done greatly, but it doesn't get into the mind and hook into it and get into different kind of ideas the way that a film or a book or even a painting will.